which was in Delhi like a dagger pointed at the heart of the Indian Union. And the view in Delhi was that Canada wasn't pursuing this threat very seriously. And when we look back, and we look back at the reports we've had on the Air India bombing, we realize that probably actually we weren't taking any of this very seriously. Indeed, many Indians think that the RCMP's negligence in the case of the events surrounding the Air India bombing, connected to many other unfortunate events, was essentially racist in nature. I think that's wrong in terms of active racism, but in terms of passive racism, who knows? We haven't always been the high-minded country we like to think we are today. So the relationship between the two countries wasn't just distant, it was actively bad. And India's relationship with many other Western countries was tinged by similar issues. So India just wasn't present in our consciousness, particularly except for those of us who were Indo-Canadians or had other reasons to care about India. And there weren't strong economic reasons to be very interested in India. We sold India quite a bit of wheat, and we gave India quite a lot of wheat and other aid, but it just wasn't a big economic factor. As usual, it was the Americans who woke up first to India's economic potential. By the mid-1990s, about 5 years after the economic reforms in India, American business started to see a huge sucking market developing in India. We were, of course, completely asleep at the switch on Bay Street and elsewhere. And so, in a dialogue between American business interests and Washington, the new possibilities that India presented were much discussed. And at the time of a very dangerous but happily well-controlled mini-war between India and Pakistan in 1999, the so-called Kargil War, the United States actively engaged India and made clear that it was willing to wipe a clean slate over the past if India would be prepared to wipe a clean slate over the past. And the Indian answer was, well, if we can agree on nuclear cooperation, we might. The Clinton administration expired at that point, and during the first 4 years of Mr. Bush's presidency, he was otherwise occupied, but everything turning sour for him on the foreign front by the time of his re-election in 2004, his thoughts turned to India as possibly the only remaining issue that could be a positive foreign policy legacy item for him. So the Bush administration pursued single-mindedly, there was no greater objective, largely unnoticed in the rest of the world, of the Bush administration to achieve this understanding with India on nuclear cooperation and unlock the Indian markets for American firms and to create a new relationship which would rebalance international relations by introducing a new balancing factor in Asia, which had been absent. All of that occurred in 2008. Canada, of course, was following this at the official level and acutely aware that we were nowhere much in India while all of this was going on, but seeking to be somewhere in India. And so several Canadian governments, certainly the government under Mr. Martin, which was aware that all of this was brewing, and our current government have been trying hard to make up for lost time. The trouble is, of course, now everybody wants to do business with India. Saying that you want to do business with India is not only stunningly unoriginal, it also means you're in a very long queue of countries, many of which are more significant than yourself in wanting to do business with So what assets does Canada have in trying to interest the Indian government in doing business with us? And by the way, as you're a Torontonian, you will all remember that the Prime Minister of India extended his brief stay at the G20 meeting by half a day to conduct bilateral discussions with our government, received an honorary doctorate from McGill at the time. And so the issue of what Canada has to offer a country like India in exchange for access to its huge markets would have been on the minds of Ottawa types. First and foremost, we're part of North American space. And just as for Americans, the Indian market was hugely significant as it started growing very fast, so for India, the United States is by far the ideal in terms of an economic system. India actually trades more with China than it trades with the United States, but the aspirations of Indians are very close to the aspirations of Americans. The individuality, there are many features, the entrepreneurship, the ambition that is a characteristic of both countries. And so for the Indians, trading more and generally having a much greater relationship with the US was nearly as important as for the Americans to have a greater relationship with India, and we can benefit from that because of NAFTA, and we do. And if Indian firms are investing as much in Canada as they are, it isn't so much for Canada, but because we share economic space with the United States. When they invest in natural resources, that of course is no surprise. Canada has natural resources in abundance, and India with 1.3 billion people, even though it's well endowed in natural resources, simply doesn't have enough for the size of its population. And it's not just a question of the size of the population. As the middle class in India expands, and it's today situated at anywhere between 35 million and 350 million people, depending on how you calculate it, its consumption patterns change, and the middle class consuming a great deal more than the ultra poor. India needs to produce more and differently than it did when pretty well everybody, except for a very small elite, was desperately poor. So our natural resources are of great interest to India. Third, there's a consciousness in India of the Indo-Canadian community. There is a realization that very large numbers of Indians, mainly from the Punjab, but not exclusively from the Punjab, have been in Canada, although they were shockingly treated, something many Canadians don't know, when they first arrived around the turn of the last century. As Canada liberalized its social values, Indians amongst us benefited from those liberalizations, and Indians today in Canada aren't just thriving economically, they're thriving as Canadians. And there's a consciousness of this in India. So our social model, or what is known of it in India, is attractive rather than unattractive. And one rarely hears in India complaints about the way Indians are treated here relative to the complaints one hears about, say, Britain or sometimes even Australia. So those are three dimensions of Canada that are of some interest to Indians. Why should we care about India? Well, first, of course, we are a trading nation, and we have relied much too much on the US market. Why have we relied much too much on the US market? It was easy. It was right there. We produced the sorts of things that they needed, or at least we harvested the sorts of things that they needed, and we could do a great deal of business with them without much effort. But the reality is that the relative weight of the United States in the world economy is diminishing very fast as the relative weight of emerging countries increases, such that the bet on easy trade with the United States doesn't appear such a brilliant one today as it might have in the 1950s. In the 70s, by the way, there was an effort to diversify Canadian trade, but it failed signally. So India is a country that in a vague sort of way Canadians know they should be wanting to trade with more without necessarily having a very clear idea about how to go about it. Breaking into the Indian market isn't easy. Operating in the Indian market isn't easy, although it's a democracy and very attractive in that respect. There are features of the Indian economy, of Indian society, that Canadians find difficult to deal with, including Canadians of Indian origin, having to do with corruption, rule of law that's very unpredictable, and other factors that have tended to worry our large businesses and keep them from engaging very seriously with India. Doesn't seem to be stopping anybody else, by the way, but it's apparently a big worry for us. So that's one element of our calculation. The second element is that when we think of countries in the emerging world that have quite a bit in common with Canada, actually India is quite high on the list. If you look at their system of governance, it's essentially the same as ours. It is a democratic country, and we bang on relentlessly about the importance of democracy in our international relations. It's an English-speaking country, at least the elite speaks English. About 5% of the population of India speaks English. So in that sense, we're comfortable with it. Our literatures have a great deal in common. Some of the greatest Indian writers of recent decades are in fact Indo-Canadian writers. And likewise, a number of Canadian authors are much read in India. The Toronto International Film Festival is the single most important international event in the Indian arts calendar. Why? Because TIFF invited Bollywood participation long before any other international festival did. And of course, Bollywood has never forgotten which festival invited it first. So there are all sorts of links that aren't immediately obvious, that actually predispose, in a sense, a growing relationship between the two countries. I think I'm going to stop there.